If you die, you die. I'm not missing the Maldives for a hospital monitor that's already beeping, Maxwell said, his voice as smooth as the silk tie he was adjusting in the reflection of my ICU window. He demanded I sign the power of attorney over to his brother before the sedation hit, claiming I was too fragile to handle the firm's transition while my heart was failing. They had absolutely no idea. They had no idea I was the one who built the double-entry encryption for the very ledgers he used to hide his consulting fees for the last 6 years. Before I show you how I turned his first-class flight into a one-way ticket to a federal holding cell, comment your city. Like and subscribe if you've ever been the backbone for a man who didn't even deserve your shadow. I'm Adrienne Hollingsworth, 54. For 26 years, I was the chief financial officer of Hollingsworth Global and the silent architect of every legacy we built. I hit send on the forensic file to Agent Silas Thorne at 10:14 p.m. Maxwell's face is going to turn ghostly pale when his corporate card is declined at the stilted villa in the Maldives. His downfall wasn't starting, it was already finished. The ICU at Charlotte Presbyterian is a cathedral of synthetic sounds. There is the hiss-click of the ventilator in the next room, the rhythmic thump-swish of my own compression boots, and the distant clinical chirp of a nursing station that never sleeps. The air smells of ozone and industrial lavender. I lay there, watching the digital clock on the wall. 10:42 p.m. Maxwell would be at gate A12 by now. He always insisted on being at the airport 2 hours early, a habit I'd spent decades cultivating in him so we wouldn't miss board meetings. Now, that punctuality was his noose. He'd be sitting in the Admiral's Club, sipping a double Macallan, feeling the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders because his burdensome wife was finally tucked away in a sterile box. My chest didn't ache from the pulmonary embolism anymore. The heparin drip was doing its job, thinning the blood that had dared to clot under the pressure of being the Hollingsworth Foundation. The real ache was the silence. It was the realization that for 26 years I hadn't been a wife. I had been a utility. I was the electricity, invisible until the lights went out. 3 hours ago, Chloe had texted his phone while he was helping the nurse settle me. He'd left it face up on the rolling tray. "Got the sunblock, Big Daddy. Can't wait to see you in those trunks." Maxwell hadn't even reached for the phone to hide it. He didn't think he had to. To him, I was already a ghost. He just looked at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth that had once convinced me to pull him through law school on a waitress's salary. "I'll have my phone on," he'd lied, leaning down to kiss my forehead. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and the faint metallic tang of a man who had already checked out. "The kids will be by in the morning. Rest, Adrienne. You've always been the strong one. You don't need me here for a few tests." I didn't blink. I didn't cry. I simply watched the way his thumb rubbed the gold band on his finger, a ring I'd paid for with my first bonus check in 1998. As soon as the heavy suite door clicked shut, I didn't call my children. I didn't call my sister. I reached for the thin silver laptop tucked into the bottom of my patient personal belongings bag. My hands didn't shake. The Sterling account wasn't just a slush fund for his mistress's Cartier bracelets. It was a $4.2 million hole in the pension fund of the 300 employees who trusted us. Maxwell thought he was a genius because he used a shell company registered in his brother's name. He forgot that I was the one who wrote the algorithms for our internal audits. I opened the hidden partition. I attached the ledgers, the wire transfer receipts, and the photos of the signatures he'd forged in my name while I was in the emergency room last night. I BCC'd my personal attorney and hit send to the FBI's white-collar task force. The monitor beside my bed gave a steady, calm beep. My heart rate was 62. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't holding up the ceiling. I was just watching it. The morning shift change brought a new rhythm to the ICU. Nurse Miller, a woman with hands that smelled of unscented soap and a face that had seen every version of human fragility, checked my vitals at 7 a.m. She didn't offer a platitude. She just adjusted the pillow beneath my head and gave my hand a brief, firm squeeze. It was the most honest affection I'd received in years. "Your children are in the waiting room," she said softly. "The doctor will let them in one at a time for 10 minutes. I nodded. My throat felt like it was lined with fine sand. I watched the door, expecting to see the frantic faces of a daughter and son who had nearly lost their mother. Tasha came in first. At 28, she carried the Hollingsworth name like a designer handbag, with a mix of pride and careful maintenance. She was wearing a cream-colored yoga set that probably cost more than the monthly mortgage on my first house. She didn't rush to the bed. She stopped at the hand sanitizer station, rubbed her palms together with clinical precision, and then approached. "Hey, Mommy," she said, her voice pitched in that high, performative tone she used for social media. She leaned down, but she didn't touch me. She smelled of Joe Malone and the cold morning air. "Dad called us from the tarmac. He was so upset he had to leave, but he said the specialist confirmed you were stable." "Stable," I repeated. The word felt heavy. "He said it was that international conference in Dubai," she continued, pulling out her phone. "He was so stressed about it. But he knew you'd want him to represent the firm. You know how he gets about the Hollingsworth reputation." I watched her thumbs scroll through her notifications. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking for herself in the reflection of the situation. I noticed the small turquoise-colored box sitting on top of her bag. Tiffany. Maxwell always bought his silence in little blue boxes. "Dubai," I said, my voice steady. "Is that what he told you?" "Yeah, he said he'd be back by Friday." She finally looked up, but her eyes weren't on my face. They were on the IV bag. "Listen, Ma, while I'm here, Jordan and I were talking. With you being down for a few weeks, someone needs to handle the payroll signatures for the Foundation's gala. Dad said he left the authorization forms in your home office. Do you think I could get the spare key?" The Foundation. The charity I'd built to provide scholarships for girls in the West End. To Tasha, it was just a line item on a resume and a way to fund her consulting fees. Jordan followed 10 minutes later. My 31-year-old son, the one I'd stayed up with for 1,000 nights helping him master his bar exam prep, didn't even sit down. He paced the small area between the bed and the window. "Dad's worried about the optics, Ma," Jordan said, adjusting his glasses. "The firm is in the middle of a delicate transition. If word gets out the CFO is in the ICU, the investors might get twitchy. We've told everyone it's just an elective procedure. Exhaustion." "Exhaustion," I said. That's a very polite way of saying my heart almost stopped. Jordan stopped pacing. He looked at me then, a flash of genuine discomfort crossing his face before the mask of the senior associate slid back on. "We just need to keep things moving. Dad said you'd understand." "He mentioned he sent you some documents to sign last night? About the power of attorney for the Sterling accounts? It would really help us keep the liquidity moving while he's away." I looked at my son, the man I'd birthed, the man I'd protected from his father's temper and his own insecurities. He wasn't here to hold my hand. He was here to secure the perimeter of his own inheritance. "I haven't signed them, Jordan," I said quietly. "Ma, don't be difficult. It's for the family." "Which family?" I asked. The silence that followed was brittle. Jordan checked his watch. He didn't answer. He just looked at the door, waiting for the 10 minutes to be over so he could go back to a world where I was a pillar, not a person. They left together, their voices fading as they walked down the hall, discussing whether the hospital cafeteria had real coffee. I lay back and closed my eyes. They hadn't asked if I was in pain. They hadn't asked if I was scared. They had only asked for keys and signatures. They had no idea that at 35,000 feet, their father's world was about to collide with a federal reality he couldn't charm his way out of. And they had no idea that the mother who had always been their safety net had just cut the cord. The silence that followed my children's departure wasn't empty. It was heavy with the debris of a life I'd spent too long perfecting. I watched the dust motes dancing in a sliver of Charlotte sunlight that managed to pierce through the hospital blinds. 26 years of marriage, and I'd been reduced to a signature they were all waiting for me to scrawl. At 11:15 a.m., the door didn't just open, it was occupied. Bernard Hollingsworth, Maxwell's younger brother and the firm's head of business development, a title I'd invented to keep his gambling debts manageable, stepped inside. He looked like a smaller, frayed version of Maxwell, wearing a suit that was too tight around the middle and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Adrienne, girl, you looking like you're fighting," Bernard said, pulling the plastic chair closer to the bed. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't mention the tubes. He just tapped a thick manila envelope against his knee. "Bernard," I said, "you're a long way from the sports book." He winced, the jab landing exactly where I intended. "Now don't be like that. We're all family here. Max called me from the air. He's a wreck, Adrienne, truly. He told me to come down here and make sure you weren't worrying about the Sterling transfer. He said you were getting forgetful about the authorization codes." Forgetful. The first brick in the wall of gaslighting. If Maxwell could paint me as medically incapacitated, my signature wouldn't matter. His brother, as my secondary proxy, could bypass me entirely. "The Sterling account isn't for the firm, Bernard," I said, my voice dropping to a level that forced him to lean in. "It's the exit ramp. I know about the $50,000 he withdrew for the charter yesterday. And I know about the $3 million moved from the Employee Health Fund last Tuesday." Bernard's face didn't pale, it grayed. He began to sweat, a fine sheen appearing on his upper lip. "I don't know what you're talking about. That's corporate restructuring. Max said you'd be the one signing the final wire if I couldn't," I interrupted. "He's setting you up, Bernard. He's in the air, headed for a country with no extradition treaty, and you're sitting in a hospital room in North Carolina with your fingerprints all over the digital transfer logs. Who do you think the FBI is going to come for when the server pings your IP address?" I watched the realization hit him. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the slow, agonizing collapse of a man who realized he'd been holding the bag while his brother held the tickets. Bernard wasn't the mastermind. He was the shield Maxwell used to hide the sun. I just did what he told me," Bernard whispered, his bravado evaporating. "He said we were just balancing things until the merger." "There is no merger," I said, reaching for the bedside remote to sit myself up further. "There is only the fall. And you have exactly 10 minutes before the flight attendants on Flight 722 tell Maxwell his Wi-Fi has been temporarily disabled by the authorities." I reached into the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out a single business card I'd hidden under a stack of napkins. It wasn't my lawyer's card. It was the card for a private investigator I'd hired 18 months ago, back when I first noticed the glitches in the payroll software. "If you want to be a witness instead of a defendant, you'll call the number on the back," I said. Bernard looked at the card, then at me. For the first time, he saw me, not as his brother's wife, but as the person who had actually been running the world he only pretended to live in. He took the card with a trembling hand and stood up, stumbling toward the door. He left the manila envelope on the chair. I didn't need to open it to know it contained the papers that would have stripped me of everything. Instead, I looked at the monitor. My heart rate was steady. I wasn't the victim of this story. I was the architect of the aftermath. The hospital tea was lukewarm and tasted of styrofoam, but I held the cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into my palms. My phone buzzed on the tray, a notification from my home security system. Maxwell thought he'd changed the codes 3 months ago. He'd watched me struggle to remember the new sequence, smiling that indulgent, pitying smile while he helped me. He didn't know I'd installed a secondary encrypted bypass into the firmware of the Nest cameras the day we moved in. A CFO doesn't just manage the money, she manages the access points. I swiped the screen. The high-definition feed showed my living room, the room where I'd hosted 3 decades of Thanksgiving dinners and silent, lonely anniversaries. Tasha and Jordan weren't at the yoga studio or the law firm. They were in my house. Tasha was kneeling in front of the antique mahogany sideboard, the one that had belonged to my grandmother. She wasn't looking for payroll forms. She was pulling out my sterling silver, checking the hallmarks with the jeweler's loop she'd pulled from her designer bag. Jordan was in my study. He was going through my desk with the frantic, clumsy energy of a man who knew the clock was ticking. He threw a stack of my personal journals onto the floor, looking for the physical hard drive I'd kept in the floor safe. "It's not here, Tasha!" Jordan's voice came through the phone's speaker, distorted but sharp with panic. He said if we didn't find the ledger before the flight landed, the indemnity clauses would kick in and we'd lose the trust funds. "Look in the floor safe, Jordan. Use the birthday code like Dad said," Tasha yelled back, her voice stripped of its yoga studio serenity. I watched them, my children, the people I had carried in my body and shielded with my very soul. They weren't mourning my heart attack. They were scavengers picking over a carcass before it was even cold. Maxwell hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he'd poisoned the well of my motherhood, turning my children into his accomplices with the promise of a wealth that didn't actually exist. Maxwell had told them I was the one who had mismanaged the funds, convincing them that I was the reason the firm was failing. He'd made me the villain so he could be their savior. I felt a coldness settle over me that the ICU blankets couldn't touch. It wasn't the sharp, hot anger of a woman scorned. It was the heavy, immutable weight of a woman who was finally done. I tapped the microphone icon on my screen. "The birthday code won't work, Jordan," I said, my voice coming out of the smart home speakers in my study. On the screen, Jordan jumped back as if he'd been struck. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and wild. Tasha ran into the study, her face pale. "Mom?" she whispered, looking at the camera lens tucked into the bookshelf. "I changed the safes combination the night you told me you were too busy to come to Sunday dinner because you were scoping out the new yacht with your father," I said. "And the silver is plated, Tasha. I sold the real pieces 5 years ago to cover the first round of your father's gambling debts. I didn't want you to know how thin the ice was." "Ma, listen," Jordan started, stepping toward the camera. "Dad told us you were sick. He said you were confused. He said the firm's money was in danger because of your health." "The money is gone, Jordan, but not because of my health. It's gone because your father is currently flying toward a life that doesn't include either of you. You aren't his heirs. You're his distractions." I closed the app. My heart rate monitor spiked to 78, then slowly, deliberately, I breathed it back down. I didn't have the luxury of an emotional collapse. I had 3 hours until Maxwell's plane touched down. The ICU is a place where time is measured in drips and beeps, but for me, it was a countdown. Nurse Miller returned at noon to change my dressing. She moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, her silence a sanctuary compared to the noise of my children's greed. She didn't look at the screen of my phone, which was now scrolling through a series of automated banking alerts. "You're very still, Mrs. Hollingsworth," she murmured, her eyes meeting mine. "Most people in this bed are fighting the air. You're just waiting." "I've spent 20 years fighting, nurse," I said, my voice rasping. "I'm trying something new. I'm letting the wind blow." She smiled, a small, knowing tuck of the lips. "Sometimes the wind is what clears the field." When she left, the room felt colder. My phone vibrated, an encrypted call from an unlisted DC area code. I answered on the second ring. "Adrienne." The voice was low, gravelly, and familiar. Silas Thorne. We'd met 10 years ago when I'd helped the Bureau untangle a laundering scheme one of our competitors had been running. I'd kept his card in my jewelry box, like a secret insurance policy. I've gone through the first 3 ledgers. The sterling shell is a mess, but the signatures on the wire transfers to the Maldives account, they're clumsy. He was in a hurry, Silas, I said. He thought I wouldn't wake up. There's more, Silas said, and I heard the sound of papers shifting, the sound of my life being reduced to evidence. He didn't just move the company funds. He filed a secondary claim on your supplemental life insurance policy yesterday afternoon. He cited imminent terminal event based on a medical report from a Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation, at a private clinic. The air left my lungs. I hadn't just been a utility to Maxwell. I had become a commodity. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He had already cashed the check in his mind. He'd manufactured a medical history for me while I was still breathing, likely to justify why he was forced to take over my assets. The doctor doesn't exist, does he? I asked. Not in this state. And the medical report he used to get the emergency power of attorney for the sterling accounts? It's a forgery of your intake chart from last night. He had someone on the inside, Adrienne. Someone in administration. I thought of the way Maxwell had been so helpful with the paperwork when I was being wheeled into the ER. How he'd whispered to the intake clerk while I was gasping for oxygen. What's the status of the flight? I asked, my fingers tightening on the bedrail. Customs and Border Protection are briefed. The moment he steps onto the jet bridge in Male, he's flagged. But Adrienne, if we move now, the brother and the kids, they're in the blast radius. You sent me footage of them in the house. That's conspiracy to obstruct. I looked at the photograph on the bedside table, the one Maxwell had insisted on bringing. It was a family portrait from 5 years ago. We all looked so perfect in our Sunday best, a sea of smiles and coordinated colors. It was a lie then, and it was a tombstone now. They made their choice when they looked for the safe instead of the doctor, I said, my voice cold and clear. Do what you have to do, Silas, but wait until he tries to check into the resort. I want him to feel the luxury before the handcuffs. Copy that. Oh, and Adrienne? I checked the vacation account you flagged. It's not just $50,000. He moved another $200K this morning via a mobile app. He's planning to stay lost. I hung up. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. I felt the sharp, clean edge of a surgeon's knife. There was a soft knock on the door. It wasn't the nurse. It was a man in a sharp, charcoal suit I didn't recognize, carrying a briefcase and a look of practiced sympathy. Mrs. Hollingsworth, I'm Mr. Vance, representing your husband's interests. I have a few final documents that require your immediate attention. Mr. Vance didn't sit. He stood over my bed, a human skyscraper of artificial concern. He placed the leather-bound portfolio on the rolling tray, right next to my half-eaten cup of lime jello. The contrast was almost poetic, the high-gloss finish of corporate greed resting against the cheap plastic of a dying woman's dinner. Max is devastated that he couldn't be here, Adrienne, Vance said. His voice was a baritone purr, practiced in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. But he's concerned that in your current state, you might be overwhelmed by the administrative demands of the firm. These documents simply designate a temporary conservatorship. It ensures that the Hollingsworth legacy remains intact while you focus on your recovery. I looked at the top page. Voluntary transfer of fiduciary responsibility and medical proxy. It wasn't just a conservatorship, it was a cage. If I signed this, Maxwell wouldn't just own the money, he would own my body. He could decide which doctors I saw, which treatments I received, and more importantly, when those treatments stopped. The legacy, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Does the legacy include the $400,000 you received in consulting fees from the sterling account last quarter, Marcus? Or was that just a clerical error? Vance's hand, which had been reaching for a gold fountain pen, stilled. The air in the room seemed to thin. The rhythmic whoosh of the oxygen concentrator felt like a countdown. "I don't follow you," he said, but his eyes darted toward the door. "I managed the ledgers for 26 years, Marcus. I didn't just see the numbers, I saw the ghosts behind them. I know about the offshore account and the Caymans you used to supplement your partnership draw. I know Maxwell promised you a seat on the board of the new entity once he restructured me out of the picture." I leaned back into the pillows, watching the sweat begin to bead at his hairline. He was a man who lived by the letter of the law, but he'd forgotten that the spirit of the law was currently sitting in Silas Thorne's inbox. "You're medicated, Adrienne. You're imagining things," Vance said, his voice losing its velvet. He pushed the pen toward me. "Sign the papers. It's the only way to protect the children's interests. If the firm goes under because of an investigation, Tasha and Jordan lose everything. Is that what you want?" "The children have already lost everything, Marcus. They just haven't realized the checks are going to bounce yet." I didn't take the pen. Instead, I reached for my phone and tapped the screen. A video began to play. It was the live feed from my study, showing Jordan and Tasha tearing through my personal belongings. "They're looking for a hard drive that doesn't exist," I said. "And you're looking for a signature that you'll never get. Now, you have two choices. You can leave this room and wait for the FBI to knock on your office door tomorrow morning, or you can take those papers and tell Maxwell's brother that the CFO is wide awake." Vance didn't argue. He didn't try to charm me again. He saw the cold, clear light of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. He snapped the portfolio shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "Max won't let this go. He's prepared for every contingency." "Max is currently over the Atlantic," I said, looking at the digital clock. "And he's about to discover that his contingency just hit a wall of blue." Vance turned and walked out, his stride hurried, his dignity left somewhere between the Jell-O and the IV stand. I watched him go. Then I reached for the plastic cup of water. It was room temperature and tasted of minerals, but I drank it slowly, savoring the way it felt in my throat. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first volley had been fired. My heart monitor chirped, a steady, unwavering 64. I looked at the screen of my phone. A new message from Silas. "Plane is descending. Mail airport is on high alert. We have a problem, though. The mistress? She's not on the manifest. He's traveling with someone else." The photo from Silas arrived a minute later. It wasn't the grainy, long-lens shot of a mistress I'd never met. It was a high-resolution capture from the first-class boarding lounge. Maxwell was leaning back, a flute of champagne in his hand, laughing. Beside him, tucked under his arm like a precious silk scarf, was Lena. Lena Vance, Marcus's sister, my college roommate, and the woman who had held my hair back while I vomited through 2 pregnancies. She was the one who had sat in the ER waiting room only 48 hours ago, weeping into a pashmina while promising me she'd take care of everything at the house. I looked at the image until the pixels blurred into a smear of gold and navy. The betrayal of a husband is a rupture. The betrayal of a sister friend is a slow-acting poison. Lena knew where the spare key was because I'd given it to her for the gardeners. She knew about the Sterling account because she was the one who had helped me set up the Foundation's first charity auction. She hadn't just been my friend. She had been the shadow I allowed into my light. "Adrienne?" Silas's voice crackled through the speaker. "You still there?" "I'm here," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "She was the inside person, Silas. Not just at the firm. She's the one who provided the fake medical reports to Marcus. She's the one who convinced my children that I was losing my mind. We're linking her to the wire transfers now. Her name is on a secondary travel visa Maxwell applied for 3 weeks ago. They've been planning this since your first fainting spell in April. The fainting spell. The one the doctors couldn't explain. The one that happened after Lena brought over her famous hibiscus tea. My hand went instinctively to the IV port in my arm. I wasn't just a victim of corporate greed. I was the survivor of a long-term assassination of my character and my health. The flight lands in 2 hours, Silas said. The Maldives authorities are waiting. But, Adrienne, if we want to freeze the domestic assets before Marcus and the kids move them, I need you to give me the bypass code for the firm's main server. The one you said was for emergencies only. No, I said. There was a silence on the other end. No? Adrienne, if they empty the accounts now, the restitution for the employees vanishes. If I give you the code now, Marcus will see the breach and alert Maxwell before the wheels touch the tarmac. He'll have time to ditch his phone or transfer the encryption keys to a private server in mail. We wait. I hung up before he could argue. I had to be the one to do this. Not for the money, but for the truth of what I had built. I hit the call button for the nurse. When Miller walked in, I didn't ask for pain meds. I asked for my clothes. Mrs. Hollingsworth, you're in no condition. Nurse Miller, I said, looking her directly in the eye. In about 60 seconds, the power in this wing is going to fluctuate. There will be a series of alarms at the nursing station. It's a glitch in the server I happen to know is being serviced remotely. During that distraction, I need you to look the other way while I use the restroom. She looked at the monitor, then at me. She saw the CFO, the matriarch, and the woman who had finally stopped carrying everyone else's luggage. I need to go check the supply closet, she said quietly. It's at the end of the hall. It usually takes me about 10 minutes to find the right gauze. She walked out. 3 seconds later, the lights flickered and dimmed. The hospital's backup generators hummed to life, and the hallways filled with the frantic chirping of system offline alerts. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The world tilted, a dizzying whirl of white and gray, but I gripped the IV pole like a scepter. I wasn't leaving the hospital. I was just going to the one place where the hospital's secure Wi-Fi couldn't be traced to a specific room. I moved toward the small, private alcove in the patient lounge. My heart was thumping, not with failure, but with a cold, rhythmic fury. I opened my laptop and entered the command that Maxwell thought I'd forgotten. Project Sovereign, initialize. The patient lounge was a graveyard of old magazines and stale air. I sat in the shadows of the far corner, the blue light of my laptop screen carving hollows into my face. My breath was shallow, each inhalation a reminder that my body was still a fragile vessel, but my mind was a fortress. Sovereign was not a corporate code. It was my maiden name. It was the name I'd tucked away in a drawer when I married Maxwell, traded for a title that made me a secondary character in my own life. Now, it was the key to his extinction. With 3 keystrokes, I initiated the severance protocol. I didn't just freeze the accounts. I triggered a mandatory internal audit of the last 10 years of Hollingsworth Global's tax filings. Filings that included Marcus Vance's legal retainers. I wasn't just catching Maxwell. I was dragging the entire ecosystem of his enablers into the light. My phone rang. It was Marcus. Adrienne, what did you do? His voice was no longer a purr. It was a jagged edge. The firm's server just issued a hard lock. I'm sitting in my office and my credentials have been revoked. The payroll accounts for the foundation just went dark. The foundation is safe, Marcus, I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. I moved those assets to a private trust under my maiden name an hour ago. As for the firm, the server didn't just lock you out. It began transmitting the sterling metadata to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. You should probably stop worrying about your credentials and start worrying about your license. You're destroying the family, he screamed. Tasha and Jordan will have nothing. You're burning the house down while you're still inside it. The house was built on rot, Marcus. I'm just providing the spark. I ended the call and leaned my head back against the cold vinyl of the chair. My chest felt tight, a dull pressure blooming behind my ribs. I knew the risk. I knew that by exerting myself like this, I was gambling with the very blood that was trying to kill me. But I would rather die a sovereign than live another hour as a Hollingsworth. I watched the upload complete bar reach 100%. At that exact moment, the hospital's main power surged back. The lights in the lounge flared to a blinding white, and the distant alarms ceased. The system offline distraction was over. I looked at the flight tracker on my screen. Flight 722 was 30 minutes from landing in Malé. Maxwell and Lena would be preparing for their descent, perhaps holding hands, dreaming of the white sands and the $50,000 villa. They would be thinking about the cocktails they'd drink, while I was being restructured in a morgue. My phone buzzed again. A text from Tasha. No blue box this time. Mom, the bank called. My corporate card was just canceled at the dealership. They're taking the car back. What is happening? Please answer me. I didn't reply. I had spent 28 years answering every whim, every cry, every demand of my children. I had been the bank, the therapist, the chef, and the shield. I had taught them how to walk, but I had failed to teach them how to stand. If they wanted to know what was happening, they could read the news tomorrow. I closed the laptop and stood up. The room spun. I had to grip the edge of a heavy oak table to keep from collapsing. I was a CFO in a hospital gown, a matriarch in paper slippers. But as I began the slow, painful walk back to my room, I felt lighter than I had in decades. I passed the nursing station. Nurse Miller was there, her eyes meeting mine briefly as she charted. She didn't say a word. She just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a woman who had gone into the supply closet and found exactly what she was looking for. I climbed back into my bed just as the head doctor, a man named Dr. Aris, not the fake one Maxwell had invented, walked in with a clipboard. Mrs. Hollingsworth, your latest scans are back, he said, looking puzzled. The clot is dissolving faster than we anticipated. Your vitals are actually improving. Are you feeling any less stress? Doctor, I said, adjusting the thin ICU blanket over my legs. The weight of the world just shifted. I'm feeling much better. The flight tracker on my phone blinked once, then turned green. Landed. I lay back and watched the ceiling tiles, imagining the humid, salt-heavy air of the Maldives hitting Maxwell's face as he stepped onto the tarmac. I could almost see him, hand in hand with Lena, adjusting his sunglasses, feeling like the king of a world he'd stolen from me. My phone buzzed. It was a FaceTime request from an unknown number. I swiped to accept. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't Silas. It was Maxwell. He was standing in the customs hall, his face a mask of sweating, jagged fury. Behind him, the blurred shapes of local authorities were speaking with a pale, trembling Lena. Adrienne! He hissed, his voice echoing in the terminal. What did you do? The hotel transfer was canceled. My cards, everything is frozen. You think this is funny? You're in a hospital bed, you pathetic... I'm in a hospital bed that I'm paying for with my own money, Maxwell, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The accounts you're trying to access don't belong to the Hollingsworth firm anymore. They've been flagged as evidence of embezzlement, insurance fraud, and attempted racketeering. You're delusional. I'll have Marcus file the emergency injunction before you can blink. Marcus is currently being interviewed by the North Carolina State Bar, Max. And your brother Bernard? He gave Silas Thorne a 3-hour recorded statement in exchange for a deferred prosecution agreement. He didn't want to go to prison for a man who didn't even put him in the will. Maxwell's face didn't just pale, it seemed to hollow out. He looked around the terminal, the bravado of a big daddy evaporating. I watched as 2 men in uniform approached him from behind. Max, I said, and for the first time in 20 years, I used the same soft, mothering tone I used when the children were small. The $250,000 you moved this morning? That was the bait. Moving that money after a federal freeze was initiated is an automatic felony. I didn't even have to report you. The system did it for me. He started to scream something, a string of insults that would have broken me a month ago, but a hand reached out and took the phone from him. The screen went black. A moment later, my hospital door opened. Tasha and Jordan were back. They didn't have their bags or their yoga mats. They looked small. They looked like the children they used to be, before they learned to value the name more than the woman who gave it to them. "The news is everywhere, Mom," Jordan said, his voice cracking. The FBI is at the office. They're saying Dad is being detained in Malé. They're saying you turned him in." "I didn't turn him in, Jordan," I said, sitting up without help. "I stopped protecting him. There's a difference." Tasha was crying now, real tears that smudged her expensive mascara. "What are we going to do? The house is in the firm's name. The cars, the tuition for my grad school, it's all gone." "No," I said, looking at them both. "The things you thought defined you are gone, but you're still standing. And you have the one thing your father never had, a chance to be honest." I reached into the nightstand and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It wasn't a ledger. It was a journal I'd kept since they were born, filled with the things I wanted them to know about being a sovereign, not a Hollingsworth. "I've spent my life being your backbone," I said. "But a backbone is only useful if the body is willing to stand up. I'm going home tomorrow, not to the house on the hill, to the cottage in South Carolina my grandmother left me. If you want to see me, you'll find me there. But I'm done being a utility. From now on, I am only a mother." The discharge papers were signed at noon the following day. I didn't wait for a limousine or a town car. I didn't wait for my children to find a ride to the hospital to play the role of the devoted family one last time. I took a taxi to the long-term parking lot where my personal Jeep, the one Maxwell called beneath the Hollingsworth brand, had been sitting since I drove myself to the ER. The drive toward the South Carolina coast was 4 hours of deliberate silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check the news alerts that I knew were currently dissecting the Hollingsworth fall. Every mile I put between myself and the Charlotte skyline felt like a layer of old, heavy skin shedding. I watched the high-rises fade in the rearview mirror, monuments of glass and steel built on the labor of a woman who had finally decided to stop holding up the sky. The cottage at Edisto Island is small, weathered by salt and time, nestled under the weeping canopy of ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It doesn't have a boardroom. It doesn't have a double-entry encryption server. It has a porch that faces the marsh and a kitchen that smells like the cedarwood of my grandmother's childhood. I spent the first evening sitting on the wooden steps, watching the tide roll into the tall grass. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, its battery dead, its screen a dark, silent mirror. Maxwell would be in a holding cell, realizing that the restructured world he planned had no room for a man with empty pockets. Tasha and Jordan would be navigating the wreckage, learning for the first time that a name is just a sound if there's no character behind it. I am 54 years old. My heart is a mended thing, scarred by the pressure of being the unbreakable foundation. But it beats now with a rhythm that is entirely my own. The air here was thick with the scent of plowed earth and salt spray. I stood up and walked to the small garden bed by the porch. I reached into the soil, pressing my fingers into the cool, dark dampness to pull a few stray weeds. I wasn't an executive, a CFO, or secondary proxy. I was just Adrienne. I watched a heron take flight over the marsh, its wings wide and certain. I am the architect of my own peace now, and for the first time in 26 years, the foundation is finally solid.